In Chapter 1, we explored how kings across history used public humiliation as a weapon against their own wives, turning marriage into a stage for domination and shame. But in this chapter, we flip the lens. What happened when these humiliated women decided not to break, but to strike back? History has buried most of their stories under layers of silence, shame, and male-centered narratives. But some queens shamed publicly, rejected cruelly, managed to turn that humiliation into fuel for rebellion, revenge, and survival. These weren't just victims of royal cruelty, they became its darkest reflections. Let's begin with one of the most fascinating women in English history, Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France and wife of King Henry II. Though often demonized in historical records, Catherine's journey began in deep humiliation. Despite being queen, she was routinely publicly sidelined in court by her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman 20 years older than Henry. He flaunted Diane at public events, had her name engraved on royal buildings, and even gave her more political access than his own wife. Catherine, forced to smile, was often made to serve wine to Diane at court banquets, a symbolic shaming ritual dressed in etiquette. But Catherine didn't forget. When Henry died from a jousting accident, Catherine wasted no time. She banished Diane from court, seized her lands, and took political control as regent for her son. Her revenge wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. She built alliances, created one of Europe's first spy networks run by women, and orchestrated the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a calculated political slaughter that changed French history. For Catherine, humiliation had taught her something profound, that love was a lie, but power was real, and she would never be publicly diminished again. Then there's the tragic and terrifying story of Empress Wu Zetian of China, the only woman in Chinese history to officially rule as emperor. Before rising to power, Wu had been a concubine of Emperor Taizong. After his death, she was sent to a convent, as was customary, a quiet exile that symbolized rejection and public shame. But Wu didn't fade. She returned to the palace by seducing Taizong's son, the new emperor, and eventually maneuvered her way into becoming his wife. Court records suggest that Wu was mocked by other consorts and ministers, labeled a dangerous woman and illegitimate empress. Gossip was spread, songs written to insult her in public squares. So what did Wu do? She eliminated her rivals, slowly, ruthlessly. Rumors say she had her own daughter killed and blamed it on the emperor's first wife, removing the queen and rising in the court. She took over court documents, religious councils, and foreign policy. Anyone who had laughed at her, from ministers to noble families, disappeared. Her rise was stained with blood, but it came from years of being publicly humiliated. First as a concubine, then as a useless woman. She rewrote the narrative by becoming more brutal than the men who once mocked her. In the Mughal Empire, a different kind of revenge took shape. Nur Jahan, wife of Emperor Jahangir, was born, a Persian noblewoman, and married into the Mughal court. Before her royal marriage, she had faced public rejection and was briefly widowed, a state that, in court gossip, made her damaged goods. Even as empress rivals mocked her rise as improper. But Nur Jahan didn't flinch. She rose to political dominance, issuing coins in her name, leading military campaigns, and writing court orders. When male ministers tried to embarrass her through court rumors, she silenced them with action, personally negotiating treaties, punishing corruption, and appointing loyal women to internal networks of power. Her method wasn't open rebellion. It was subtle domination. She used the same tools meant to shame her gender, femininity, expectation, and twisted them into weapons. Sometimes. Though, humiliation led not to revenge, but to emotional and psychological collapse. Consider Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, wife of Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. As public unrest grew before the Russian Revolution, Alexandra was increasingly publicly criticized for her German heritage and closeness to the mystic Rasputin. Pamphlets accused her of being a traitor, a seductress, even a witch. At royal balls, nobles refused to speak to her. Artists painted her in mocking cartoons. Political leaders openly mocked her in the Duma. Her response: she doubled down on isolation, retreating into Rasputin's circle, cutting off other advisors, and unintentionally helping fuel the revolution that would end her reign and her life. In this case, a king is supposed to protect his queen. But what happens when the crown becomes a weapon, and the throne turns into a stage for psychological warfare? Across centuries and civilizations, some of history's most powerful rulers used public humiliation as a tool not just of control, but of cruelty. Their targets weren't enemies or traitors, but their own wives, women who were meant to be loved, honored, and protected. What drove them? Insecurity, jealousy, sadism, or the twisted need to remind the world who held ultimate power. Let's begin in the opulent courts of ancient Rome. where the emperor's word was law, and his wife's body could be used as both a trophy and a warning. One of the most chilling examples comes from the reign of Emperor Elagabalus, a young ruler known for his erratic behavior, sexual fluidity, and public extravagance. Among the many women he married, one wife, Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin, became a symbol of forced defilement. Vestals were sacred priestesses sworn to chastity. Elagabalus not only married her illegally, but paraded her around the streets of Rome, mocking the sacred Roman traditions that protected such women, by doing so. He wasn't just humiliating Aquilia, he was humiliating an entire cultural ideal of purity. Roman citizens watched in shock as their emperor turned sacred vows into a vulgar circus act. Aquilia, meanwhile, stood silently behind her husband, dressed like a bride but treated like a fallen idol. No rebellion, no voice, just public shame, in the name of royal ego. But Rome wasn't alone. In medieval France, a more psychologically disturbing custom emerged: the public bedding ceremony. On the night of a royal wedding, the bride and groom were not given privacy. Instead, nobles and priests would gather around the bed to witness the couple lie down together. In some cases, the couple was expected to remove their robes in front of everyone, then be tucked into bed by attendants while blessings were chanted. Curtains would be drawn, but only after enough people had seen that the union had, in fact, begun. Now imagine the trauma of a young royal bride, often just 14 or 15 years old, forced to strip in front of powerful men and women, strangers, all while pretending to smile. For the king, this was a chance to assert dominance over his wife and over the court. Her body became a symbol of legitimacy. His power wasn't complete until it had been publicly proven. This wasn't a celebration, it was a psychological branding ritual, and for the woman, it often marked the beginning of a lifetime of controlled shame. Fast forward to 16th century England, where kings like Henry VIII didn't need public ceremonies to humiliate. He weaponized public opinion itself. When his second wife, Anne Boleyn, fell out of favor, Henry didn't just execute her. He orchestrated a public shaming campaign. Pamphlets were spread across London, accusing her of adultery, witchcraft, and incest. False testimonies were dragged into court. Anne, once a queen of unmatched charm, was walked through the Tower in broad daylight, her dignity shattered. Witnesses noted her trembling, though she held her head high. Her trial was a public spectacle. Her body was used to reinforce a narrative: a king must never be challenged, even by his own wife. But perhaps one of the most brutal examples of public humiliation in royal marriage comes from imperial China under the Ming dynasty. Here, the emperor's wives and concubines were locked in endless competition, but when one displeased the emperor, punishment wasn't always silent. In some cases, the emperor would host court banquets where his wife or consort was forced to serve lower-ranking women, dressed in servant robes. This wasn't just emotion, it was deliberate degradation. In one recorded instance, a high-ranking consort was accused of lack of elegance during a poetry recital. The emperor commanded that she clean the banquet hall floors in front of courtiers, her jewels stripped, her hands raw, while junior concubines giggled behind their fans. The humiliation was the punishment, and it served as a warning to every woman in the palace. These stories from Elagabalus to Henry VIII to the Forbidden City may span continents and cultures, but they share a psychological core: the king's fear of irrelevance. Public humiliation rituals were not just acts of cruelty, they were a twisted form of self-validation. When a ruler felt threatened, whether by a strong-willed wife, a shifting court, or a fading sense of masculinity, he reached for the cruelest weapon available: public shame. And in most cases, the queens couldn't resist. Bound by culture, trapped by duty, and silenced by power, they endured their punishment under watchful eyes, sometimes weeping in silence, sometimes smiling through it, always knowing that their pain was part of the performance. But what does that do to a person when your